Peter instructs us in this letter that we should always be ready to give an account, an explanation for the reason for our hope, for our faith, for our love. If someone asked you that question today, what is the reason for your hope, for your faith, for your love? How would you answer them? Many years ago, about 12 years ago, I was a younger priest, just recently ordained, and working at a parish on Long Island, a Jesuit parish. And we frequently went to hospitals and nursing homes to serve as chaplains. And I was fairly new at this, so a little awkward, a little bit unsure of myself. One day I showed up, and at the top of the list was a woman who had marked that she was Catholic, but she didn't indicate wanting communion. I walked into the room, and she rolled her eyes at me, and I thought, we're not getting off to a very good start here. But I decided I'd brave on, and I sat down beside her bed. She's a youngish woman in her mid-70s, and I have to admit, very taken by how vulnerable she seemed. She said to me, "So what kind of priest are you?" I said, "I hope the good kind." She said, "No, are you from a religious order?" And I said, "Yes, I'm a Jesuit from St. Anthony's Parish." She said, "Oh, really? So you'd still do that kind of thing, those Jesuits?" I said, "Yes." She said, "My uncle was a Jesuit. He was a chemistry professor, and they sent him to Africa as a missionary in the 50s, and he died in a motorcycle accident over there. But she told me that she was so inspired by him as a young woman that she went on to do her PhD in the sciences, which at that time was fairly unusual. But she went on to tell me that during the process of her study, she lost her faith. She could no longer reconcile being a scientifically minded, empirical person and being a person of faith. For her, these things became mutually exclusive. And now, many years later, here she is in fairly extreme circumstances in this hospital bed. And she asks me this question: why do you do what you do? She couldn't fathom anymore why someone would live this way. So I thought I should answer her by telling her why I became a Jesuit, and told her I'd grown up Catholic and went to a Jesuit college in upstate New York here at Lemoyne, and encountered Jesuits and lay people who really inspired me to want to give back because I'd been given so much. And she said, no, that's a nice story, but that's not what I'm interested in. She said, why do you believe? Now, as a kind of young whippersnapper, fresh out of my theology training, I still could remember some of St. Thomas Aquinas' proofs for God's existence, kind of rational proofs. And I started to go into the first proof and the second one, and clearly this is not what she was interested in. She became kind of exasperated with me, and she said, no. She took a deep breath and she said, I want you to tell me about God in your life. I was at a loss, I have to admit, at that moment, because no one had ever put me on the spot in quite that way. And I didn't have words, at least not words that I had thought through. But I started to speak from my heart about the first time in my life I remember experiencing a sense of God's presence. Maybe some of you can think back to that moment for yourselves. For me, it was when I was sleeping out under the stars as a Boy Scout, and the Milky Way was spread out on top. It's just amazing to me. There I was on my back, on this hard ground, the only one still awake, everyone else snoring away. And I felt how amazing it is to see the infinity of space above me and the beauty and the infinite number of stars, and to somehow acknowledge that as small as I was, that I was conscious and awake at that moment, and that there was some kind of miracle in that. You know what I'm talking about, those kind of moments? And clearly this is what she was trying to get at. So I went on to tell other stories. Stories about how in high school at one point when my parents were having some marital tensions, and I remember going to God in a spirit of desperation because I was so afraid of what might happen. And there was no reason for the peace that came into my heart at that moment except that grace is real and affects us in ways that are surprising. And I went on to tell her about how in college I didn't ever think about becoming a Jesuit or a priest. I wanted to be helpful to people, but I didn't think I had the faith to do this. And how at one particular moment in my discernment, a moment on retreat, and I felt God put me on a solid rock and reveal to me that God was that rock, and that it wasn't going to be my own strength that was going to be the source of my vocation, but it was going to be God's gift. I told her about the first time as a young Jesuit I fell in love and had to deal with the crisis in my vocation, and how I had to dig deep to understand at a whole new level why I would live this way. And then about a time in theology when I was studying theology from a very scientific and historical point of view, and I thought, well, where is God still in this? And how God revealed God's self, but in a totally different way than I expected. Or, now it's 10 years ago today, you know how my dad passed away 10 years ago today. And nonetheless, I felt this sense of God's presence, comforting and consoling. Do you know what I'm talking about? Contemporary atheists these days are very aggressive in suggesting that we should be able to explain our faith the same way we explain the way that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, with a scientific explanation, nothing mythological, nothing superstitious. But I must tell you, when I hear people demanding that kind of explanation for God's presence, I just don't get it. I don't see how that could ever be enough. It's a little bit more like how you explain that certain piece of music that you hear, and every time you hear it, it moves you to tears. Why? Or how you attend, an event at a museum, and of the thousands of paintings you see, one captures your attention and recruits you to it, and you seem to be transfixed by it because of its beauty, and no other one speaks to you in the same way. It's how we explain to strangers why we remain in the spousal relationships we are through thick and thin, or why we remain committed to children who have hurt us and turned their back on us, but nonetheless, we love them. If you were put to that test, if you walked out of the doors of this church this afternoon into the sunshine, and someone was to ask you, why did you just spend the last hour where you did? What would you say about God in your life? Would you tell them about the ways that you feel touched by the Word and by the example of Jesus? Would you share with people how at times in this experience of community, even amongst strangers, you feel a sense of connection that reassures you that you're not alone in the world? Would you share with people how sometimes at Eucharist you feel a sense of God's presence right within you, reassuring you that the divine lives as close to you as your own breath, as your own heartbeat? If someone was to ask you the question, why do you believe what you believe, what would you say?